Thank you so much. I think it's, for most women, it always tends to be an interesting journey. So it's always fun to talk to other women, and I've had a lot of fun speaking with many of the other featured speakers today. I was here at ISB a few months ago, speaking to the students about career options, planning their career. What struck me without exception, every single woman I spoke to asked me, how do you manage work-life balance? Not one single man did. Now, I don't know what that means. Do men care less about work-life balance? That's a possibility. Is it something that, that they care about, but they're shy to bring up because they think it doesn't reflect well, takes away the macho a little bit maybe? That's a possibility. Or is it that women are already starting to think of their career in terms of marriage and babies and assuming that they will bear the brunt of the responsibilities of childcare and home management? And the men are assuming the same thing. That's a little troubling because it means that things haven't changed that much from the days when I was interviewing for placement after IIM Cal, and recruiters would routinely ask all the girls, do you plan to work after having a baby? I mean, that was the days when it was politically correct to ask that question. I don't think they would ask it anymore, but it's an unspoken thought. But while the topic of my talk today is about women, work, and balance, I don't think balance is just a women's issue. What does balance mean? One plays a lot of different roles in life, mother, father, brother, sister, husband, wife, all of these. But balance is really about who are you over and above all of that. What are the passions that drive you? What are your interests? Who are you as a human being? Balance is about finding space for that human being. And if that's what balance means, then I don't think it's a women's issue. And actually reducing it to a women's issue or one that addresses, only married people with kids is really sort of trivializing something that impacts everyone. It's a very skewed perspective. Many years ago, I read this book about women in America and business. And one of the points it made was that women of that generation sort of grew up with two role models. One was, the domestic stay-at-home goddess mom, who would manage everything in the house, manage the kids, and be this warm, wonderful, welcome presence. And the other one was the dad who sort of went off and, fought these unknown dragons and came home with the winnings. So, one was adventurous, challenging, exciting, and one was as comforting as apple pie or, in my case, rasam chawal. So I think one of the things is that as a society in transition, we do have both of those role models for women like us today. And one of the challenges, particularly for us in India, is that there's still much more focus on the traditional expectations from women, despite the fact that we're also encouraged to go out and have a career. So that kind of puts an added stress on how women expect to look at their lives, how they expect to look at their careers. Meanwhile, I think there's a transition for men as well. They grew up with a generation of more patriarchal dads, who are a little more distant, a little more hands-off. But they want to be dads who are more hands-on. They want to be more involved husbands. They want to have a life. Work is not the only thing in their life anymore. And yet the expectation that the man will continue to be the sole or the chief wage earner, the key provider for the family, kind of bogs them down a little bit as well. Because society basically puts value on men's work accomplishments. So how do they balance all of their identities? So I think it's a question for everyone. What are the things that help you attain work-life balance? I have a confession. I don't have magic beans, really. I don't have all the answers. I don't think anybody does have all the answers. I think what you can have is some answers that work for you. And the answers work, one day at a time. They work from time to time. You have to keep chopping and changing things around in your life. That's the only way that it works. There are days when I come home so late that my kids are asleep and I can't say good night to them. And I hate that. But then if I make a good presentation or if a client likes our work, there's a strategy that I can see working for somebody, I love that. I miss PTA meetings. I miss, the days when my kids have holidays from school and I have to go off to work, and that is killing. I mean, believe me, it hurts me more than it probably hurts them. They're looking forward to a day without mom supervision, running amok with the iPad. But it really hurts me. On the other hand, I like the intellectual stimulation that my career gives me. I like not being a mommy and a Mrs. something. I like, being who I am. So it's, on good days, I think I can do it all. On bad days, I've got my resignation letter in my laptop bag. So I think it really does change from day to day. And there's no one answer for everybody. It's really, balance means doing what's right for you, getting it right for you and yourself. Therefore, I think it's a very individual journey, and that's why I said I don't have magic beans. I can just tell you kind of what's worked for me so far. So one of the big things is really to keep a long-term perspective in mind. It's very difficult for competitive MBA types from institutes like ISB to say, keep a long-term perspective. Don't be so worried about the race in your career. But it's important, because life will throw curveballs at you, and you need to kind of create the space by having a longer-term perspective. I consider myself the most unmaternal woman that I've ever met. 3 children to the contrary. I don't know how that happened. But, I was completely blindsided and surprised when, my eldest son was born. And for 6 months, emotionally, I just wasn't ready to leave him at home to be taken care of by somebody else. Even when I got back to work after that, I really just took up a part-time job for 3 years because I couldn't handle the thought. So, and it was a complete surprise. It was not something I'd factored in. So I think it may not be childbirth, it may be something else, but there will be life events which kind of need you to have space for them. Life is kind of larger than career. Hillary Clinton said, there's a career and there's a life, don't confuse the two. So be very clear, it's, life is a larger thing. So make space, give yourself time. Don't pace yourself by your peers, by your colleagues, by your classmates, by your batchmates. It's a hard thing to do, this gift of patience. It's very hard, but if you can do it, if you give yourself the gift of time, it's really going to be incredibly helpful, and you're going to need that time, I promise you. And the other thing that you can do is, if you give yourself that time, you'll kind of also make breathing space for who you are as an individual. You'll have a little more space for those things to flourish about you, rather than the aspect that's only concerned with work. The second thing, don't forget yourself in the rush to balance out the other parts of life. I think particularly for those of us who are parents, we know that, the urge is to spend every moment when you're not at work or in the office with the kids. It's all about the kids, because that's what we kind of start defining as balance of life. But, balancing also means balancing out your individual needs against those of the family, because otherwise, beyond a point, everybody is going to be driven mad, including yourself and especially the kids. So really, make space for yourself, cut yourself some slack. I think that's something that Ranjini said earlier as well. So do what you need to keep you sane. Don't go by the tactics other people have followed. If you need to hire extra help at home, go right ahead and do it. Hire a driver so you can nap or read during your commute. That really helps. Take a half day off and go shoe shopping. That's, I think, my weakness. So do what you need to do to keep you sane, really. And remember, you cannot manage everything, and you cannot manage everything perfectly. So prioritize the things that are going to be important to you. And honestly, learn to let go a little bit. My house is really far from the neatest house you'll find. It's usually pretty messy. But I've realized that for me, getting that free time to read or chill out with the kids or write or do something else, go play in the garden or whatever, is much more important than having a spotlessly tidy house. So I've learned to let go. And similarly, you have to figure out what it is that you're okay to let go of. But if you can do that, you'll honestly have less guilt, you'll have less stress, and you'll find time freeing up for the things that you really want to do, the things that really float your boat. So give yourself some TLC. The third important thing, I think, is to be a real partner and to let your partner be a real partner. Many women fall into this trap, particularly after childbirth, that, you take on the entire role of childcare and home management, regardless of whether you're working outside the home or not. There's role modeling that I spoke about earlier. There's a lot of social conditioning that goes into it. There's this feeling that, the men just can't do as good a job as we can. But, and there's this whole turf issue that childcare is supposed to be my expertise. I'm born intuitively knowing how to do childcare. But, that just means that you'll always be the person on call. So you have to learn to hand over the baby, and then don't assume, the baby will survive, honestly. Or whatever it is that you hand over, it will survive. Things may get done a little differently. Dessert may come before starters, but that's all right. It will happen. And I think for men, the other thing is that they are always stuck with this unspoken expectation, even in the most equal marriage, of being the chief or the solo wage earner. So that gives them very little flexibility. If they want to take time off, how are they expected to do it? Because, somebody's got to bring home the bread and the bacon, right? So some examples, when I was working part-time for 3 years, there would be times when one of the kids was sick, and between my husband and me, it was never an issue that because I'm working part-time and therefore clearly earning much less, that I will always be the one to stay at home. It was really about who has a more urgent situation at work that day. And therefore, the other person stays at home and takes care of the baby because, there are 2 sets of DNA in that baby. And, and one of the good things that came out of that balance was that I was able to always keep a career going. And so some years later, when he decided to take a year off and be a filmmaker, we didn't have to worry about the bread. Maybe the bacon, but not the bread. So, just think about it. What if you had an agreement in your relationship that either of you could take a break when you need it? How would that change the way that you approached your lives and your careers? How would that change the way that you built up your relationship and your lives, right? Think about that. That said, the typical workplace really still is much more geared to the hunter archetype that we were talking about earlier. It's all about being aggressive, if not assertive. It's hyper competitive. It's about face time. The days when the corporate workplace evolved, historically, it was a time when women really weren't very well educated. They were not encouraged to go outside the house and work. They had mainly domestic interests. So, and the whole of society believed in male superiority. And therefore, the workplace was really kind of an extension of the gentleman's club. Well, that's clearly no longer the case. As you can see, from our list of speakers today, there are more women in the workplace than ever before. They're an integral part of the workforce. And the other interesting change is that from work being a necessity to keep body and soul together, for many of us, luckily, it's really become a form of self-expression. It's not just about keeping body and soul together. It's also about who you are and your ambitions and your aspirations in life, which are other than those of your career. So, people today want to be invested in and fulfilled by all aspects of their life, not just the personal life, So, given that we're lucky enough to be in a position to do that, work-life balance does become more important. Since the recession, the company I work for does a lot of research. One of the things that we found is that people have a new way of thinking about happiness. The job, salary, and rank alone doesn't cut it anymore. They want a broader, wider, deeper definition of happiness. So given that, I think companies need to evolve new corporate structures, cultures that allow for work-life balance. They don't need better policies for women. They actually need better policies for all their employees, So men also have more flexible options, as women should, so that people who are single don't feel that their desire for balance is somewhat illegitimate. And so there are fewer penalties if somebody chooses a slightly different approach to the path rather than a race to the top. Why should companies care? I think Shalini spoke about it a little bit during her session. Because, employees who are happy with their employers, they tend to stay there longer, they tend to be less stressed out, they tend to be more efficient, they tend to be more productive. The other thing, we were talking about the brain earlier, Ranjani mentioned the human brain. So employees who have time to pursue other interests outside of their work, they actually stimulate more parts of their brain, so they're just more creative, they're more engaged, they're more mentally agile, they can bring in fresher perspectives, new ideas. Also, having better work-life policies means that companies can attract and retain better female talent. And that's really important because women play a huge role today in purchasing decisions. And really, you need managers who can think beyond pink, honestly. Sorry, that's a separate soapbox, but yeah. And the other thing is that, which was mentioned earlier, is that companies with women executives actually have better management styles. Companies with women on the board actually have higher profitability than companies which don't. So for all these reasons, I think it's important that companies change. And this is where we come in. People from institutes like ISB and IIM and INSEAD, we as managers, there'll come a time when we will be in positions in corporations where we can set the tone, we can set corporate culture, we can change corporate culture. We can kind of shape how the workplace of the future evolves. As entrepreneurs, which many of us are planning to be, we'll be able to put systems and processes and leverage technology in order to create work-life balance for ourselves and for our employees. As decision makers, we'll be in a position to be able to design products and services and that enable better work-life balance for everybody around us. And as leaders, we'll be able to impact and reshape social norms because of our work styles and examples. So I think when it comes to work-life balance, the change really has to start with us. It's up to people like us, not just women, but men as well, to talk about the kind of changes we want to put into place so that we don't feel torn, so that, there's not always this conflict that's going on inside of us, stressing us out. It's up to us to kind of be able to forge non-linear career paths that are still perfectly robust. And it's really up to us, both in our individual capacities and as decision makers and leaders, to ensure that work-life balance is more than a set of words on a recruitment brochure.